there are lots of ways to retaliate. And so once that happens, then the U.S. again counter-retaliates, and we end up in this sort of death spiral of bad things. I do worry a lot about what that will look like.
Could this be the end of globalization as we know it? The specter of looming U.S. tariffs is casting a long shadow over the interconnected world. Are we on the brink of a new era of economic isolationism? What horse trading is going on behind the scenes at Mar-a-Lago? And will the new president come into office with a plan to make America great again by imposing trade barriers on its neighbors? I'm joined by Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. Deborah, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you start off with some high-level overviews of what countries will be impacted the most when it comes to this Trump tariff?
I think it could be significant. There are a lot of people who think that Trump is using tariffs as a bargaining chip for some kind of negotiation, some kind of agreement. But I think if you look at his history and his record, when he says tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, he's serious about that. He intends to impose tariffs, and they could be quite high. They could be easily at 100%. They might be significantly less. It depends on his mood on any given day. But I would expect tariffs to be in our future.
What about specific sectors? Are there going to be certain industries that are going to be harder hit than others?
Well, he says he's going to impose tariffs on everyone. And so that's possible that we would all be paying the costs of having higher tariffs. Obviously, we don't all, outside of the U.S., all pay these tariffs. But U.S. consumers certainly will, and they may end up buying a lot fewer goods from overseas than they used to. So the most exposed areas are those with the highest level of deficit viewed from the U.S. of trade in goods. So it's really about trade in goods. It's not about services. It's not even really about agricultural goods. It's about manufactured products. And I think those who are in the greatest firing line, again, are those that are most exposed to U.S. in those sectors, including electronics, clothing, footwear, etc.
Many economists say that tariffs could have blowback effects on the U.S. economy as well, and inflation being one of those. What are the risks associated here?
I think more than people expect. I don't think this is a bargaining tool, because if you're Donald Trump, what are you bargaining for exactly? What is it that you're looking for? He's not running again. He's very fond of the use of tariffs to get what he wants, including revenue. I don't think he's using them as a tool. I think he's going to impose tariffs, again, potentially on all of us at 10%, with much higher spikes for example, China. He's already announced in the last few weeks that he's going to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico at a much higher level than they imagined, over separate issues in immigration and fentanyl exports. So I think there's a variety of things that he might do, and the net result is higher tariffs on products into the United States.
Oftentimes, though, tariffs is not a win-lose situation. There are implications to the domestic economy as well, inflation being one of them. Do you think his administration is concerned in any way?
I think they're prepared to bear a pretty high cost. They would argue that in order for the United States to get on the pathway to future recovery, in order to get more jobs in manufacturing, there is a price that has to be paid. And I think they're prepared, at least at the moment, to let American consumers pay those prices, because every tariff results in higher costs for the U.S., and it does result in higher inflation pressures. I think they're ready to impose those. Now, we'll see how firmly they stick to their initiatives. But the plan is to impose tariffs, and if it costs a lot more, it's a short-term price to pay.
Back in the 90s and 2000s, Americans actually saw globalization as a good thing. But more recently, we really have seen sort of this shift in sentiment. What is causing this?
I think there's a number of reasons that the U.S. has lost enthusiasm for open trade. One of them has to do with technology and the shift in jobs driven by technology that left a lot of the U.S. with fewer job options, especially for non-college educated people or even high school dropouts. You know, that community really has suffered as those manufacturing jobs moved offshore, largely due to technology. A second challenge, I think, is that the U.S. is less exposed to trade than other places. So we're sitting in Singapore. Singapore's trade to GDP or domestic economy ratio is often as high as 300%. So trade is 300% greater than the size of the domestic economy. The U.S. is very different. In the U.S., the size of the U.S. economy is so big that trade is only about a quarter of the overall size of the U.S. economy. And so that makes it less exposed to trade in general. And for consumers, they can buy an awful lot of goods and services domestically. So they're less exposed overall to the benefits of trade. And then the third thing I think matters is that especially companies stop talking about the benefits of trade for their own employees. And that let the people started to assume that trade mattered to someone else, but not to them directly. And I think those three things together led us to lose enthusiasm for trade in the U.S.
So there are two schools of thought, basically one that sees that Trump will follow through with his heavy-handed policies, but others think that ultimately there will be a much more watered-down version when it comes to these tariffs. What is your view?
Well, Trump seems to like to impose tariffs first and then negotiate after. So that suggests that there may be fairly high tariff rates put on early. And then if you come and you offer some kind of benefits, you buy aircraft or something, then maybe those get ratcheted down, or maybe not. Maybe he takes the aircraft and keeps the tariffs in place. I don't think you should expect that this is discussed, not imposed, or imposed at a very light level and then gradually ratcheted up. I think it may be the reverse.
And there are already several meetings sort of happening even before he's in office, behind the scenes. Is this part of his strategy to ultimately get what he wants?
I think yes, but I think the real challenge is what is it that he's looking for? And what he's looking for is going to vary, of course, by country. But overall, this is not a man, in my view, who needs a deal. For what purpose? Again, he's not running for re-election. He's already shown that he can make fantastic deals.
Now, you've made a whole career out of negotiating free trade agreements. We know that borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers, but why are you such an advocate?
Because ultimately, I think you don't get growth and economic opportunities if you don't have trade. It's not a perfect silver bullet for everything, but you can't get jobs, and you can't get jobs for rural populations, for disadvantaged groups, for women, for small businesses, if you don't expand the pool of trade. And so for me, trade is important, but it's really important because ultimately it's what drives economic growth, jobs, employment, etc. And I'm worried that as we go into 2025, we are narrowing that space for jobs and economic growth into the future, and it's going to happen globally. That is extremely damaging, again, especially developing countries, small businesses, women, entrepreneurs. That's very worrisome.
And what about retaliation? Is there a fear or a risk that tariffs could be imposed to the U.S. and be weaponized against itself?
Yes. And I think one of the things that I find striking is that many of the Trump team seems to think the U.S. will impose tariffs and the other side will simply capitulate, that they will capitulate and offer gifts as an added bonus. But there doesn't seem to be any realization that the other side might retaliate in very different kinds of ways. It may not be tariff for tariff. It could be tariff for, movement of people or permits to work in a company or whatever it happens to be. Like, there are lots of ways to retaliate. And so once that happens, then the U.S. again counter-retaliates, and we end up in this sort of death spiral of bad things. And so I do worry a lot about what that will look like.
Have you given much thought to what are the best case scenarios or whether there's any upside to trade tariffs?
I think it's challenging for me to think about upsides. I mean, professionally, of course, when you work in a trade organization and trade is a disaster, yay. But I think it's hard to come up with real win-win outcomes because we're in a very unusual situation. It's not just that Trump himself has got different views about the way the economy should be structured. It's that the global system that we have come to rely on for decades is under pressure anyway. So when you push on a very weak system, it starts to fall over. And that is a very different environment that none of us have experience with. So again, how do you think about that? That's unsettling personally to, I think, most people because we're changing what kinds of things matter, who's responsible, how you frame situations, and all of that feels very disconcerting and is extremely hard if you're a company to figure out, what do I do next? So if you're asking me sort of win-win, eventually, yes, of course, things could probably be great. But between now and then, and it could be longer than we expect, I think it's going to be very unsettled for an awful lot of people and companies for sure, but also for governments who are trying to navigate this new, it's not really normal, but this new world that we're in.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for your insights. A big thank you to our special guest, Deborah Elms, Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of I See Your Trade Season 5. I See Your Trade is brought to you by IC Markets, a leading high-performance trading provider. Trade up to IC Markets. See you next time.